I've spent the last few videos talking about single winner voting systems that I would not want to use for general elections, but haven't gone into much detail about what I would want, and this is the video for that. And in a move away from ranked ballot voting systems, I will be talking about rated ballot systems, such as score voting and approval voting. With a rated ballot system, instead of simply ranking the candidates in order of preference, you are saying how much you like the candidates. In score voting, each voter gives a score to each candidate out of a set maximum, say 10. So every candidate gets a score from 0 to 10. And then, quite simply, the candidate with the highest total score wins. Approval voting is even simpler. Voters vote for, or approve, as many or as few candidates as they like, and the candidate with the most votes wins. This is equivalent to score voting, but with scores out of 1. So it is score voting in its simplest form. In contrast to ranked ballot methods, such as alternative vote and Condorcet methods, with their various complexities and paradoxes, score voting is a very simple and clean system and very easy to understand. And unlike a ranked ballot, if a voter is presented with a score ballot with no previous knowledge of how the election works, they could make a reasonable guess of how the votes would be counted. And they'd almost certainly get it right. And even more so with approval voting. Scoring candidates is also easier for voters than ranking them for anything other than a small number of candidates, because once you've identified your favourite and least favourite candidates and scored them, you can give the others scores based on this scale in any order you like. But a full ranking can get quite tricky with a lot of candidates because you can't just work down the list. Each time you rank a candidate, you need to identify your next favourite. If you accidentally miss any candidates out when working out your order, you might have to change quite a few ranks to get things back on track. Of course, one caveat to this is that methods that normally use a ranked ballot can infer the rank information from a score ballot, as long as they can accept tied positions. Score voting and approval voting pass the participation criterion. A voter can never get a worse result for themselves by turning up and casting an honest ballot. It might seem obvious, but this undesirable scenario can happen with the alternative vote and Condorcet methods. There is also another fairly well-known rated ballot method called majority judgment. In this system, instead of electing the candidate with the highest total score, it elects the candidate with the highest median score, so basically the score given by the voter in the middle. But this system also fails the participation criterion, and at the moment I'm generally not as convinced of it as I am with score and approval voting. And I'm not going to go into it in great detail here, but there is an analysis of it at this website. All on-screen links are given in the video description below. Score voting and approval voting are also monotonic. If a voter changes their score for a candidate to a higher score, or from non-approval to approval, this cannot cause this candidate to go from winning to losing. Again, this might seem obvious, but alternative vote fails this criterion. Strictly speaking, score voting and approval voting pass the independence of irrelevant alternatives criterion. If a candidate is removed from the election after voting has taken place, then the result order of the other candidates won't change. Ranked ballot methods all fail this because if you remove a candidate, the rank positions of some of the other candidates will change as a result of this, which can affect the result. But under score or approval voting, the scores or approvals given to candidates are not fundamentally rooted in the existence or not of other candidates. If, for example, a candidate turned out to be ineligible to stand after the votes were cast, all the scores or approvals given to the ineligible candidate could simply be ignored without anything else changing. However, in the real world, voters would vary their scores based on who is standing. For example, a voter might give 3 candidates 10, 5 and 0 out of 10. But if their favourite of these 3 wasn't standing, then they would be very unlikely to give a score of 5 to their favourite of the remaining candidates. This would be to waste the power of their vote. They would change the 5 to a 10. Similarly, with approval voting, if a voter approves just one candidate, then if that candidate was not standing, it's highly unlikely that they would approve no one. So while score voting and approval voting may pass independence of irrelevant alternatives in theory, they don't do so in practice. But they are still likely to be more robust against irrelevant alternatives than ranked ballot methods. With a score ballot, voters are always likely to give the maximum score to their favourite and 0 to their least favourite, and then score the other candidates based on where they fit on this scale. So if a candidate dropped out, unless it was a voter's unique top scoring or unique bottom scoring candidate, the scale wouldn't change, so the scores given to the other candidates would be unlikely to change. Similarly, under approval voting, unless the candidate that drops out is uniquely approved or uniquely not approved by a voter, then it's likely that the rest of their vote will remain unchanged. Score voting and approval voting, unlike first past the post and most ranked ballot methods, both pass the favourite betrayal criterion. It's never strategically advantageous to you to do anything other than give a top score or approve your favourite candidate, regardless of how you rate the other candidates. Another advantage of score voting and approval voting is publication of results. For all its faults, in a first past the post election, you can just publish the number of votes for each candidate, or the percentages, or both, and it will be quite clear who won and by how much. And with score voting and approval voting, it's much the same. You can publish the total or average scores for score voting, or the total number of approvals for approval voting, or indeed just the percentages of the maximum for both of these methods. It will be very easy to read and digest. This isn't the case with alternative vote with its multiple rounds, or Condorcet methods with their head-to-head comparisons between each pair of candidates. And this is definitely a strong point in favour of score and approval voting. I'm going to talk specifically about approval voting for a bit now, before moving on to score voting. Approval voting is a nice simple step up from first past the post, without adding complexity. Under first past the post, a lot of people vote strategically for their favourite of the two frontrunners. Under approval voting, it still makes sense to do this, but you can also vote for your outright favourite as well, if they are not one of the frontrunners. You don't have to pick one or the other. This is a massive advantage. A simple rule of thumb would be to vote for your favourite of the two frontrunners and anyone else you like more. And because voters would not be deterred from voting for their favourite candidate, this should go a long way to reduce the extent of two-party domination that can plague first-past-the-post elections. Some people might object that approval voting must surely violate one person, one vote, if you can vote for several candidates. But as I mentioned in a previous video, if by one person, one vote you simply mean name one candidate then shut up, then it does fail. But then it's also not something I would see any reason to want to adhere to. One person, one vote, used reasonably, just means that each voter gets to cast one ballot, whether that involves naming one candidate, ranking them, rating them, or whatever. Also, with approval voting, if you vote for every candidate, then it would have the same effect as voting for no candidates. So it's not as if approving more candidates simply means giving you more voting power. And if you see approval voting as a basic form of score voting, then it should become clearer. If there are several candidates and you give them all scores out of 10, then it would take a pretty weird interpretation to say that this is a violation of one person, one vote. And if scores out of 10 are fine, then so are scores out of 1. And that's all approval voting is. Approval voting does suffer to some extent because it doesn't allow voters to make much of a distinction between the candidates. There are just two levels, approved or not approved. Compared to scores out of 10, or a full ranking, it does seem rather impoverished. You might decide to approve both of your two favourite candidates, but then you'd have no power to say which of these two you like more. And there are election scenarios where this could matter. If it's a tight three-way contest and you like two of the three frontrunners, then it makes sense to approve them both to make sure that your least favourite doesn't get in. But then you have no say over which of these two you like more. On top of this, some voters might decide that everyone else will approve both, so that they can get away with approving just one. And if enough people do that, the single candidate you don't like could get elected, even if they're less popular than the other two. Of course, while this problem does exist with approval voting, it's far worse under first past the post, where you have to pick one candidate or the other. If there are two similar candidates, they could be doomed from the outset. It's also a problem for score voting, but not to the same extent as approval voting, because you can indicate some support for your second favourite candidate without giving them the top score. And in situations like this, Condorcet methods arguably perform better. A situation like this is known as the Burr dilemma, but election expert Warren D. Smith, admittedly an advocate of score voting and to a lesser extent approval voting, has found only one major election where he thinks that approval voting, had it been in use, could have given the wrong result because of this, and that was the 1986 Portuguese presidential election. And approval voting does have its advantages. Although it only has 2 levels, these levels are an indication of how the voter feels about the candidates. In a ranked ballot system, a voter might hate all but their favourite, or like all of the top 5. The information isn't there. And despite the Burr dilemma just mentioned, approval voting appears to be generally less badly affected by strategic voting than ranked ballot methods. As said, it never fails to betray your favourite, it's monotonic, and it passes the participation criterion. Approval voting is also much simpler than ranked ballot methods, on a par with first past the post. And any problems it does have are also suffered by first past the post, and generally to a much greater extent. Because of this, it appears to be the only system that first past the post has no advantages over. When we had the referendum on the adoption of alternative vote for our general elections in the UK, one argument in favour of first past the post was that it is a simpler system. Not that alternative vote is that complicated, and this was overplayed somewhat, but the fact that first past the post is simpler is undeniable, even if it doesn't come close to making up for its shortcomings. But if we were ever to have a referendum on using approval voting instead of first past the post, as far as I can see, there are no legitimate arguments in favour of first past the post, and plenty in favour of approval voting. So unlike other voting systems, we can say that approval voting is strictly better than first past the post. And then we have score voting. Full score voting, where a voter rates candidates from 0 to say 10, is still a fairly simple system, but gives voters far more freedom to express their feelings about candidates than approval voting. And unlike ranked ballot methods, scores indicate how much a voter likes a candidate, more than another candidate. Someone can indicate that there is only one candidate that they would tolerate, or that they'd basically be happy with their top 3. Ranked ballot methods have no way of distinguishing in this way. So basically, approval voting is strictly better than first past the post, and score voting is a step up from approval voting while still remaining relatively simple. After all, approval voting is just a less expressive form of score voting. So we can see score voting as a logical progression from first past the post. In previous videos, I criticised ranked ballot methods by saying that voters could exaggerate their vote by ranking their favourite of the 2 frontrunners top and their less preferred of the 2 frontrunners bottom, and that sometimes this could let in an outsider who not many people wanted elected. But obviously this exaggeration could happen under score voting as well. Voters would give a maximum score to their favourite of the 2 frontrunners and 0 to the other one, so it suffers from the same problem. But I don't think it's actually that bad. For a start, giving the maximum score to your favourite of the frontrunners doesn't prevent you from giving a maximum score to any other candidate as well. And giving a 0 to your less preferred of the frontrunners doesn't stop you from giving a 0 to other candidates you don't like. There's no need to try and put a lot of candidates between them. It's the points gap that matters. So less popular candidates wouldn't pick up extra points from this exaggeration and sneak in through the back door, and it's unlikely to have such a damaging effect on the results. One problem that people have with score voting is that it can fail to elect a candidate that is the favourite of an outright majority of voters. Take the following ballots with scores out of 10. 7 voters give candidate A a score of 10, candidate B a score of 7, and C a score of 0. 2 voters give A a score of 0, B a score of 10, and C a score of 0. And 1 voter gives A a score of 0, B a score of 7, and C a score of 10. And the result is that A gets a score of 70, B gets a total score of 76, and C ends up with a total of 10. So candidate B is elected. 7 out of the 10 voters, a majority, prefer candidate A to any other candidate, and yet score voting awards the election to candidate B. Can this be right? I would say yes. Even if a majority of voters prefer candidate A, every voter would be reasonably happy with candidate B. No one has given B a score lower than 7, whereas A has 3 scores of 0. So to me, electing candidate B is not unreasonable. In any case, candidate A is still likely to be elected if voters vote strategically enough, but neither result seems to be a disaster here. But if we say that a candidate that is the first choice of the majority of the electorate is automatically the best choice, it leads to contradiction. I used the following example in a previous video, and I'll use it again now. 2 voters rank candidate A top, followed by B and then C. 3 voters rank candidate B top, followed by C and then A, and 4 voters rank candidate C top, followed by A and then B. In this case, there is no candidate that is the favourite of the majority, and no Condorcet winner, one that is preferred by a majority to each other candidate when compared head to head. Candidate A beats candidate B by 6 votes to 3, B beats C 5-4, and C beats A 7-2. But with the biggest margin of victory and smallest margin of defeat, candidate C looks like the best choice. But if candidate A was not standing, then candidate B would be preferred by a 5-4 majority to candidate C. If we're using the majority criterion, then in an election between B and C, B must be the best winner. But the existence or not of candidate A should make no difference to who is the better societal choice out of B and C, and yet it would appear to in this case. And the same problem arises even if we decide that A or B should win in the original three-way election. There's an anecdote where the philosopher Sidney Morgenbesser is in a New York diner and is offered apple pie and blueberry pie. He picks apple pie, but then he's told that they also have cherry pie, and so he changes his mind and picks not cherry but blueberry. This illogical scenario is what adherence to the majority criterion can lead to. Now, I'm not saying that score voting would necessarily solve this problem, because people would adjust their scores depending on who is standing. But what I am saying is that if you insist that a candidate who is the favourite of the majority must be the best societal choice, then it leads to contradiction. And this leads us neatly into the next question. How can we say, independently of these voting systems, which candidate is the best societal choice? Without such a measure, it seems we can't objectively judge voting systems. We have all these criteria that have passed by some systems and failed by others, but how do we decide which to give more weight to? What really matters? Can we put all of this together to say which is the best voting system? Well, certainly we can't do this using any sort of majority criterion, but that doesn't mean it can't be done. We can apply a bit of utilitarianism thinking. We can say that each candidate would give each voter a certain amount of satisfaction if they were elected, which can be expressed numerically, and that the candidate that gives the greatest total satisfaction would be the best societal choice. But obviously we're not mind readers and can't tell exactly how much each voter likes each candidate. But what we can do is run computer simulations and see which voting methods give the greatest amount of total satisfaction to voters under a variety of conditions, including honest and strategic voting. And this has been done by Warren D. Smith, who I mentioned earlier. What he actually measured was something called Bayesian Regret, which is the opposite of satisfaction. It is how much loss of satisfaction there is through not always picking the best winner. So a theoretically perfect system would give 0 Bayesian regret. But to cut a long story short, score voting outperformed the other systems in these simulations. With the assumption of honest voting, it was top ahead of the board account and Condorcet systems, followed by approval voting, alternative vote, and first past the post. With strategic voting, score voting was joint top with approval voting, with ranked ballot systems quite a way behind, suffering a lot more due to strategy. So can we say that score voting is now definitively the best? No. Computer simulations such as these have built-in assumptions, and while this result is positive for score voting and approval voting, it should really serve as encouragement to others to run their own simulations and publish results explicitly stating any assumptions used. Smith is a known advocate of score voting, and while I'm not saying that this has caused bias in the results, it's also not something that everyone is going to be happy just to take at face value. In conclusion, if I were able to pick any single winner system to replace first past the post for our general elections, it would be score voting. But I'll be open to evidence on this. I don't consider this to be open and shut. Despite what I've said previously, I do think that Condorcet methods do show some promise, and there are other rated ballot systems such as majority judgment, which I didn't discuss in much detail. But I'm fairly clear that there are many systems that would be vastly superior to what we have now in first past the post. And if score voting does seem too big a jump in one go, using approval voting as a stepping stone would be a good idea, because we get a lot of the benefits of score voting without any increase in complexity. And from there we could potentially make the step up to score voting at a later date. But then we have to ask whether this is the right direction to be going in anyway. Do we even want Parliament to be made up of the winners of several hundred distinct, unconnected elections? I will be discussing that question in my video on proportional representation. But even concluding in favour of proportional representation would not render the discussion of single winner methods obsolete. Parliamentary elections are not the only elections. There are many other elections where there is just one position to be filled, and in such cases we do need to decide on a good single winner system to use, and in most cases, as things stand, I would probably use score voting. Thank you for watching my video. If you enjoyed it, you can subscribe to my channel. Even better, you can buy my book, Stuff and Consciousness, Connecting Matter and Mind, by me, Toby Pereira. It's all about how your seemingly non-physical thoughts and feelings can come from your physical brain. It's available in paperback and also on Kindle. Links are available in the video description below, or you can visit my website at www.tobypereira.co.uk. Thank you.